So let's talk about Talis. In this Talis overview, I'm going to go real quick through the basic functions and mechanics of the weapon. I think for Talis, from my experience, it's not really, how the weapon works, but how you use it. And so for this video, when we go over Talis, definitely want to focus on the things you really want to practice and understand when it comes to using Talis. I will say Talis is a very interesting weapon. Definitely a fan of its weapon action. Some of its photon arts and their abilities I'm a little iffy on, but once again, that really comes down to how you want to use it and the other things that you want to combine it with. But anyway, let's get into the basic functions. Normal attacks. I will say normal attacks for Talis are pretty good. You've seen me use Talis Launcher, and I use the normal attacks for Talis for a reason. They're fast, they're good at PP recovery, and it allows you to get in and out of situations, especially when things might get dicey. Photon arts. Now there are two of them. The first one is Converge shot, and this is probably going to be your go-to attack. Essentially what this does is it creates a single target line of sight strike. It could be for fire, ice, or lightning, so it converts all of your techniques into this one Converge shot. So anytime you're focusing down a single target or a boss, this is going to be your go-to. Now, the second photon art has two forms, Spread Feather, and I'll call them version A and version B. Version A is interesting. I don't see too many uses for it other than it being a Converge shot that can hit multiple enemies. Definitely more of a fan of version B, which if you use the photon art and you let the animation play out, it then creates a full circle, an AoE attack essentially, so that when you're in the mix of things, you can be hitting all enemies with that technique. Now the weapon action is interesting. I put the weapon action personally close, if not in the same tier as Wired Lance when it comes to utility. It has two forms, depending if you get the skill or not. Both are great, and both have their situational benefits. Specifically, when we look at the multi-form, it allows you to hit up to 3 targets. So this is great when you're mobbing, or if you're fighting a boss with a mob, because those 3 cards will hit 3 individual enemies, giving you PP back, and it's about 2 PP per hit. So you should be looking at about 6 PP when you use the multi-form. With that said, it does have the slight consequence of not doing as much damage, and it doesn't necessarily fire unless something is in range. One of the things I've noticed about the single form, or the form that you'll have if you don't have a skill, is that it will fire no matter what. And as long as you're targeting something, it will try and hunt. The multi-form needs something to be in its proximity before it triggers. So if you're going to be using Talis for mobbing or for more all-around purposes, you definitely want the multi-form skill. Tricky Capacitor. This one's pretty simple. It's a go-to skill. If you're going to be using Talis a lot, you're going to want this skill. Essentially what happens is that after you've built up enough meter, given other Talis attacks, it allows you to use an active skill that essentially hits the enemy for a good amount of damage, especially considering the range and the auto aim, but also gives you PP back. One of the things you're going to want to be cognizant of Talis is how you manage your PP. Of course, if you use Force, there's a lot of PP management skills, but if you pair it with things like Launcher or even Rifle Grenade, that can also give a lot of PP utility to allow you to keep using the Talis photon arts and attacking as much as possible. Now, the Photon Blast is interesting. One of the things you're going to be mindful of, like the rifle Photon Blast, the minute you activate it, whatever area you target it, that's the area that it is going to strike. So there might be many situations that the enemy you were trying to hit moves out of that range and you missed most of it. Fortunately, the final blast does have a pretty good radius, so you'll likely hit with that one, but the other attacks that lead up to the final hit could miss. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing that I can't fully confirm, but I do think is a mechanic of the Talis Photon Blast, is that it does add status element. If you remember from one of my previous videos, bosses and enemies now have status thresholds. So once you've reached that threshold, they'll be frozen or they'll be burned or whatever that status effect or element that they're weak. It does appear that the Photon Blast adds to that gauge. So that's something to keep in mind when you want to use it, because it can help you apply status effects more frequently. So let's get into what I really think is important for Talis, and that's how to use it, not necessarily how does it work. The benefits of Talis is that, of course, it's a ranged weapon and it's very fast. When it comes to applying status effects, this is going to be the go-to weapon. The rate of fire that it has, the amount of times that you can hit a target and apply those units of status element, nothing else competes with it. If there's one weakness I would call out from Talis is that it does require line of sight. Now what I mean by that is that all of the photon arts shoot in a straight line. We'll focus on Converge shot because that's really going to be the main photon art you want to use, especially when bossing, is that it does have some vertical range, but for the most part, whatever you're looking at, that's where it's going to fire in that straight line. And this gets tricky because Talis does most of its damage when it's not only hitting an elemental weakness, but an enemy weak spot. So one of the things you're going to have to be mindful of is how you line yourself up with the target. Because if you're not hitting the weak spot, you're not going to be doing the most effective damage. So this is also going to be something you want to think about when you think of multi-weapons or you think of subclass. What are things that can help cover some of these weaknesses? If an enemy has a shield or a breakable part, it's not going to be doing the most effective damage. So what can you do to break it so that when that weak spot is exposed, you can then use the Talis for that maximum damage, applying those status effects and taking that enemy down. And this gets into something that I call staying or fighting in the pocket. And now this just isn't for Talis, this is actually for all range classes, but fortunately one of the consequences of Talis's line of sight is that it's going to teach you how to stay and fight in the pocket. Once again, line of sight is important. You want to line yourself up with the enemy weak spot. One of the things you're going to need to be comfortable with Talis is staying in front of the enemy and dealing with its attacks through sidestepping, or if you multi-weapon and that multi-weapon has an invasion technique, you don't want the enemy to be moving around or chasing you too much, because what ends up happening is they hide their weak spot through movement, especially for weak spots that are very small. The minute the enemy turns around, if you're not line of sight with the enemy weak spot, you are not doing the most optimal effective damage. So what you're going to want to do is control your movement to help control the enemy's movement, so that you are always looking at that weak spot and being able to target with the Talis photon arts. Once you start moving and trying to avoid attacks by just keeping distance and staying out of the way, you now open that variability of movement that the enemy has, and now you yourself might have to chase down that weak spot. I also want to bring this up because I've noticed this happening in a lot of party play, or at least play where there's a lot of players. A ranged character will, for whatever reason, take the aggro, and instead of staying in the pocket, they move around a lot. They're always running away, essentially kiting the enemy. One of the problems with that is the rest of your team, they have to chase it. Because if you're the one drawing aggro, the enemy is going to respond to your position. You are pulling weak spots and opportunities to attack away from your team. Not only that, you're actually pulling opportunities away from yourself. Because if you're always trying to keep that max distance and kite the enemy, you're reducing the chances that you can use things like counterattacks. That's a lot of damage that you're missing out. So one of the things that you're really going to want to be thoughtful of when you're practicing Talis and understanding the weapon is keeping that line of sight. Fortunately for Talis, that line of sight is your strength, but also your weakness. And so as you're thinking about that, learning how to sidestep, learning how to step dodge, learning potentially other multi-weapons that might help you if you're having issues with the step dodge. Rod comes to mind because Rod Guard essentially allows you to stay in place, parry or guard the enemy's attacks, keeps you in that line of sight, and makes you more effective overall. Other than that, I would definitely say Talis is a boss weapon. Though it does have Spread Feather, both version A and version B, which are more mobbing. For me personally, its range is a bit tricky. The fact that you always have to be line of sight kind of limits you, and I, for one, am not a fan of using the photon arts for mobbing per se. I would say if you're going to mob with this weapon, the basic forms of the techniques without the Talis photon arts are going to be your go-to, which you'll want to think about as you are thinking about things such as multi-weapon, but also classes. If you're going to want to make this work, you're going to want to think about, okay, mobbing might not be a strong suit. What do I need to do to combine to make it better if I'm not going to use another weapon? And this gets into, I know, a question that many of you might have. Should I be Force or should I be Techter? Because of the line of sight issue, and it's not really an issue, basically just because of the line of sight that you have to consider for Talis and staying in the pocket and fighting in the pocket, you're going to be very, very effective at medium range. Even though this is a long range weapon, when you think about the opportunities to sidestep, the opportunity to do counterattack damage, and really build all of that up in addition to your techniques, you're gonna have to want to play close range. You're gonna want to be playing in sometimes risky, if not dangerous situations. So for me, Techter is more suited for those situations. The other thing you have to think about is Force is very keen on PP regeneration. And when you think of multi-weapons, when you think of the Talis weapon action, it is fairly PP efficient as long as you understand rotations and how to balance things out. So you want to think about that as well, is that does the Force kit, even though it does use Talis, is it really effective for what you're trying to do as a playstyle? Especially when there's Rod, and Force is very heavily guided towards Rod. Force has lower health and can't take a lot of hits per se. So you want to be careful of that risk that you're putting yourself in as you're needing to stay in that pocket, stay in front of your target so that you can target the weak spot better. The other thing that I want to call out is Talis does not play well with things like Barda-Blot or Zondi Clad innately. When you're in your Talis Photon Art form, you cannot stack Barda-Blot. You cannot stack Zondi Clad. So if you want to use those mechanisms, you're going to have to get out of the Talis Photon Art form. Now, of course, you can use the skill Talis Revoke to control that. But depending on the situation and what you're really trying to do, they don't necessarily align as well as they could, especially since Talis is a Force weapon. The other thing that I want to call out is Talis PAs do not have charges. So when you're thinking about things like Photon Flare, even though Photon Flare gives you a damage bonus just to all of your techniques, one of the things you're gonna have to be mindful of is that the other benefit of Photon Flare is charge techniques and Barda-Blot and Zondi Clad and putting all of those together. So really thinking about, is Talis really suited for some of those main class Force skills? Of course, PP Convert is always gonna be helpful, but when you think about things like the rifle weapon action, the grenade, which gives you PP, launcher, which gives you PP, Talis weapon action that gives you PP, in addition to the normal attacks that are fast and have great range, do you necessarily need that all the time, or could you be doing other things? So for me, when I look at that, all of those things, needing to be close range, needing to fight in the pocket, which is dangerous, needing to take hits at times, and understanding how Talis doesn't play well with things like Barda-Blot, I'm more in favor as a main class, Talis being Techter. At least for me personally, I'm not concerned with the PP issues. I have launcher, sticky bomb to give me PP. I can balance it, especially with tricky capacitor. I'm looking for what helps me stay in the pocket, what helps me not only get a little bit more damage through Shifta, but also increasing that status element through Shifta Amplify. With that said, Force is going to be the better subclass. Techter is pretty much Shifta and D-band. Once you get outside of that, sure, you have the Talis skills, but you don't have much else. And so when you think about PP Convert and the other abilities that Force provides, it is likely the better subclass. And so one of the things that I play around with is Techter Ranger. If I was going to main class Ranger, Force is for sure the subclass if I wanted to use Talis. One of the reasons for that is the synergy that it has with Weak Bullet or Blight Bullet in Global. So if we remember, Blight Bullet has a 15-second expiration time. So after 15 seconds, it goes away unless you reapply it. After 100 hits, if you have that skill, you can increase the duration. One of the great things of a rifle Talis multi-weapon is that your weapon action for Talis lasts 18 seconds, hitting 1 time per second. So anytime that it is out, it will hit whatever you're targeting 18 times. This not only gives you PP, but with Weak Bullet, will also give you upwards to 15 free hits. So as you're either in solo environments or even in team environments, every time you have Weak Bullet up, you can get 15 hits for free, getting to that 100 hit gauge. And then of course you just keep reapplying Weak Bullet before it expires, and it provides great synergy. So those are just things to think about when you're thinking about using Talis, understanding how you want to play it, what you need, because depending on those decisions and what you want to do, Techter might be better, Force might be better, or another main class might be better, but what do you attach to that main class as the subclass? So once again, hope this was helpful. Really Talis is about how you take advantage of what it does and how you control for some of its weaknesses, like line of sight and staying in the pocket. And of course, this concept of fighting or staying in the pocket, we'll definitely explore more. I'll have videos showing you how I practice and, trying to stay in the pocket and the opportunities that it provides me that running away or trying to keep maximum distance and kiting the enemy do not, especially if in certain situations I have the aggro in a UQ when I'm with 7 other people. How do I stay responsible of not only increasing my optimal attack selection, but making sure that the enemy isn't tracking me all around the map, taking opportunities and damage away from the team. So other than that, hope this was helpful, and I'll catch you all next time.